Hi, and welcome back to Democracy Cracks. In this mini-series, we examine the fractures in our democratic systems and what we need to do to heal them. In the first episode, we looked at what political trust actually is, why it matters so much, and we discovered that the picture is not as bad as we often think. Today, we're moving one step further into the story to search for the moment where trust begins to slip. I bet you have already heard, or maybe you even said it yourself, that politicians lie or that they don't listen anymore. Disillusionment grows, it accumulates, and before we know it, it shapes how entire societies relate to democracy. But is this the whole story? In this episode, we're digging into the roots of disillusionment, where it starts, how it spreads, and who, if anyone, is to be blamed. When I think about political disillusionment, the first image that comes to my mind is a shared house. You live there, you get along with your flatmates, you pay your share of the rent, you follow the rules. So of course you get super frustrated when something goes wrong. Imagine, for instance, if the roof starts to leak. You ask for help, but no one really answers. Or at best, you're asked to wait. So clearly, everything gets worse. Then it's only natural to start wondering, why am I even trying? The frustration is very real, also outside the metaphor. Political disillusionment is not a buzzword. It's the slow accumulation of daily disappointment people feel about the way they're governed. So, disillusionment is personal long before it becomes a political problem. And we see it clearly in the data. A 2025 Ipsos survey shows extremely low satisfaction with democracy in the countries surveyed. In Italy and Spain, only 27% of people say that they're satisfied. And it's even worse in Croatia and France, where it drops to 19%. And this came up again and again in my conversations, like the one with Kelsey Belts, heads of global partnerships at the Good Lobby.
I think there's a really dangerous perception that if you made a choice, or if you voted, if you participated in something, people don't listen. People feel like they are asking for one thing and then they get the opposite. And that can very quickly disillusion people because then they either say, well, I don't care anymore. Why would I put in the effort to say what I think if nobody's going to listen? So I think the disillusionment comes from not seeing your decisions respected.
So yes, disillusionment is emotional, but it's not imaginary. It comes from somewhere very real, and it's something we can measure. My voice doesn't matter, nothing changes anyway. Over time, that feeling settles in. For example, 49% of French people, 76% of Polish people, and 60% of Spaniards see the lack of accountability among politicians as the top threat to democracy. The impression that leaders are not on our side can progressively shift to the impression that they are not accountable for their mistakes at all. And that brings us to the next question. If so many people feel unheard or misled, is the real problem a lack of honesty and responsibility from those in power? Let's go back to our shared house for a moment. How are we supposed to know who has to fix things when they break? No one is taking responsibility, but everybody is definitely angry. We already talked about the fact that not everything can or should be perfect all the time. Democracy is the organization of disagreement after all. But when problems pile up, when promises are not delivered, and when answers stay vague, it's not only responsibility that's floating in the air. It's also the conviction that not everybody is accountable to the system. And it's not just a few scandals. It's about the widespread belief that corruption is still everywhere. And by widespread, I mean 69% of Europeans in 2025. These are perceptions, yes. And we would need an entire other podcast to talk about the reality of corruption. Though, let me just drop here that Transparency International recently estimated that corruption costs the EU 990 billion euros every year. The real issue is that this perception is tied to another one, that corruption cases are not pursued sufficiently, or that efforts to address corruption are not effective or applied impartially. That's what the accountability gap feels like in politics. And apparently, we are not the only ones thinking that.
I think accountability is a huge problem. It's another reason that at the Good Lobby we work on transparency and accountability. We've seen so many snap elections. Like, how many snap elections have we seen? Too many. In the last 12 months, the more that politicians start to think short term, they were already thinking short term when it was even just 5-year election cycles or 2-year election cycles. So if there's this constant threat that every 6 months a government's going to collapse or you're going to have a no confidence vote, you're going to have a new prime minister, people are really kind of thinking only about themselves, is how I would frame it.
The survival mode that Kelsey talks about has consequences. And it's not just about the headlines. ActEU asks people how they would react even to so-called minor dishonest acts. Take, for instance, a public lie or hidden favor. The results were clear. Even these make people see a politician as less likable, less representative, less worthy of support. People do notice, and trust takes a hit. I know many of you are probably thinking about a very famous US elected representative who doesn't shy away from blatantly lying or sharing fake news, and who still got elected and remained supported. This is because perceived trustworthiness does not automatically translate into electoral punishment, for reasons that would take far too long to unpack here. But lack of accountability is only one part of the story. Ophélie Omnes, an independent specialist in public affairs and diversity, equity, and inclusion, has more to say.
When you have so many different steps of the process where there is this discrepancy between what the people is showing it wants and what people in power are deciding to implement, I think is where the gap grows bigger and bigger. And I think that there is this like political honesty that you should have as a decent politician that we are lacking a little bit in the people who are stepping forward to have responsibilities.
What's interesting here is that the problem grows from this discrepancy between what people express through their participation and what political leaders and even democracy actually deliver. The accountability gap as such is not abstract. It's evident in our daily lives. It's when trust is expected but doesn't feel reciprocated. I can't stop wondering, though, are we expecting too much? Where does frustration meet reality? Maybe I'm stretching this house metaphor, but bear with me. If your house needs repairs that take forever, or if the landlord keeps ignoring you, of course the frustration is real. And yet, if we take a step back, not everything in the house is falling apart. Think, for instance, of the solar panels installed just a few years ago and that quietly cut your energy bill. Our democracy are a bit like that. Definitely not perfect, sometimes painfully slow, but not entirely dysfunctional either. So the question becomes, is all this disillusionment actually justified? According to Kelsey, part of it absolutely is.
I think a lot of disillusionment actually is justified. I mean, I myself tend to be fairly, shall we say, pessimistic in certain realms. I don't know if we've delivered on what we wanted. I think we've delivered on certain aspects, but then there's other things that are very emotional for people that don't feel like they've been delivered. I think that the EU is at a real crossroads at this moment in terms of can it, and it's not an enviable position. Like, I don't have the perfect advice, but can you deliver on climate and also economic growth at the same time? I think it's hard to deliver on every policy aspect all the time. Nobody has a perfect delivery, but I think we're living in a very polarized and fractured society, and that's making it harder because you can pretty much only deliver for like half of the people at any given moment. And then when you try to make a compromise, both halves hate you. So it's kind of a zero-sum game.
This is crucial because for many people, disillusionment doesn't start with institutions, but with their everyday lives. For many people, it's rooted in material conditions. In ActEU, we have asked people across Europe how they react when they struggle financially. And the result? People who say that they have trouble getting by are much less likely to trust institutions. And this is not only about the actual number in the bank account at the end of the month. It's also about the feeling of not making ends meet. Everybody has felt it in recent years. Housing prices almost doubled in the EU between 2015 and 2023. Energy prices hit record levels in 2022 after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Inflation is pushing up the general cost of living. And let's not forget general growing inequalities. Between 2006 and 2021, the share of people below the poverty threshold increased across most EU member states. All of this is just digging the hole of disillusionment deeper, showing that it can be structural and not just about ethics or transparency. And my conversation with Ophélie went in the exact same direction.
I think there's a disconnection, but there's always been a disconnection. Like, let's not fool ourselves into thinking that 50 years ago, politicians were closer to the people. I don't think that's true. But I do believe that the disconnection is more problematic now than it was 50 years ago because society is evolving so fast. And here we talk about how fast or not fast something evolves and about what people's issues are. And I think that what we're lacking the most is, again, the honesty, but the honesty to be looking the people in the eye and tell them it's a lot more complicated than you think it is. Because I do think that the main difference between type of systems or governments we had 50 years ago and now is how incredibly more complex and more interconnected our economies have become. And in order to face that and to tackle that, it requires solutions at multiple levels, which means national, European, or even international. And I think that politicians do underestimate how much people can understand that these problems are complex.
So clearly, the overall context doesn't help. And it doesn't take much to see that globalization, multipolarity, and interconnections make governance so much more complex. Problems today are huge, cross-cutting, transnational, and they require multi-level solutions that don't work in silos. Take the example of climate. Yes, it's an environmental issue, but it's also a major international security challenge, affecting our stability, resources, and thus increasing the risk of conflicts. And none of this can be solved at one political level alone, due to these precise interconnections. But instead of acknowledging this complexity and adapting the messaging, it feels like politics often get reduced to oversimplified slogans or impossible promises. Maybe I'm only talking about myself, But it doesn't seem so far-fetched to think that disillusionment doesn't only come from mediocre politics or tougher living conditions. It might also come from being treated as if we couldn't understand why things are complicated. So here we are in this messy, complicated house we call democracy. Echoes of frustration are resonating through the stairwell, but some voices are clearly louder than others. Not wiser, just louder. And loud enough to start shaping the whole conversation. Now would be a good moment to ask what happens to democracy when the loudest voices drown out the reasonable ones. What I mean is that the perception of a democratic crisis is magnified by who speaks the loudest. And here, we need to talk about the far-right parties and movements. But let's first take a look at the definition. In ActEU, we have 3 points. First, they are populist. Populists argue that society is divided between two groups, the so-called corrupted elites and the people. Of course, they claim to stand on the side of the people. Second, they are nativist. This means that they support anti- or restrictive immigration measures because they claim to prioritize the rights of people born in the country. Clearly, they're forgetting that these don't all look like them, but that's another topic. Third, they are authoritarian. They favor order and so-called strong leadership. And as the 2024 European election showed, these parties are making significant gains across the continent. They won the election or arrived second in many countries, like Austria, Czechia, France, Germany, Hungary, Italy, Slovakia, or the Netherlands. And this has been brewing for decades. We are talking about an increase of 20 percentage points in the share of voters choosing an anti-establishment party between the early 90s and today, from around 12 to 32%. And what is even more striking is that half of what we call anti-establishment voters support far-right parties. And what do we mean by anti-establishment voters, you might ask? Well, usually people who express their disillusionment with traditional politics, often because they've lost trust in traditional parties or institutions. See how everything ties back to one another. And when I spoke with Heather Grab, senior fellow at Bruegel, she highlighted that the rise of these voices is not happening in a vacuum.
There are a lot of reasons for the rise of particularly radical right populism. A lot of that is about the breakdown of the traditional left-right divide, particularly after the Cold War, but also with globalization and changes in the economic policy consensus. There's the way that mainstream parties have withdrawn from certain issues. They've just stopped talking about them, and that allows the radical right to take them on as a core agenda. And there's also the way that mainstream parties have moved towards the position of the radical right on some hot button issues like immigration, rather than defending their former policies and explaining them. So there are quite a lot of reasons for that. On the whole, radical right populism flourishes. In fact, all kinds of populism, also extreme left populism, they all flourish when mainstream parties withdraw from issues and when they create more room on the political spectrum. And I think that's happened more because of the way that the grounds of contestation of political issues have changed.
What Heather is describing here is not just the rise of one political family, but a deeper shift in how political disagreement is structured in our societies. It's a slow fracturing of the traditional ways we have organized political conflict, especially around certain issues. She had more to say about why identity has become so central to politics today.
In the past, the left-right divide that was there from after the Second World War until globalization, a lot of that was about economic policy choices. The left said we need more state intervention, we need more welfare state, we need to have the private sector more regulated. Whereas the right said we want to have less state in the economy and we want to have not only the voices of workers, but also those of other sections of society. So you had a divide which was a lot about economic policy. That's broken down with globalization, with a much more of a move to the center and towards a neoliberal consensus on economics. And what's happened is that the radical right have come up with issues of identity to replace issues of policy choices, so that elections are far more about, do I feel like I belong to a particular group or not? Do I feel like my society and my government are serving the interests of my group in society, rather than will this policy deliver for me and for the whole of society? So it's a more of a divisive political agenda, but it's also one which is far more about culture and identity and far less about policies.
But another question follows. Is polarization itself always a problem? Or is some degree of disagreement not only inevitable, but necessary for democracy to function? That's exactly where Daniela helped us sharpen the picture.
Yeah. So if I come back to this first question, so I would say yes, of course, we need a bit of polarization. And the question is, of course, how high or how much polarization do we need? So we need different positions because this is how political life is always structured and how our societies are structured. We always had debates over time. So in the past, we always had this debate between left and right. So we know that there are some leftist positions, there are more rightist positions, and there are center positions. So this is the classical cleavage structure, actually. But societies and politics has become much more complicated, at least during the last 20 years, I would say. So we do not only have this left and right scale, but we also have, like, for example, party competition on a more cultural scale. So when we think of polarization, we do not need to only see it with regard to left-right, but also with regard to this more cultural axis of political competition.
This is very interesting, because what they are both explaining is a massive shift in how our politics work. When mainstream moderate parties leave certain topics to be occupied by the loudest extremes, or worse, copy their rhetoric for electoral gain, the space gets filled by the most oversimplified, emotional messages, pointing the finger at easy targets like immigrants. And when trust is weak, something shifts inside us. We become much more receptive to simple, angry alternatives. It's not because people suddenly become extremists. It's because extremes offer something mainstream politics often fail to provide: clarity, someone to blame, the emotional certainty that the problem is there and that's how we will easily fix it. And in uncertain times, emotional clarity is incredibly powerful. Okay, I think that's enough for now. I don't know about you, but I really need to digest all this. If we had to summarize this episode, let's say that it was about the moment when frustration becomes loud enough to shake the walls. And while a lot of disillusionment is justified, and there is definitely a lot of work to do, maybe the entire place is not collapsing. The moment feels very fragile, with the foundations shaking. This is because the system we operate in encourages short-term political survival, and also because some really vocal people hate our house. And all this can easily be exploited. So political disillusionment is not just a random word. It's something that people can experience directly in their lives. And just like trust, it's not uniform. If you are part of the quiet majority, caring but not shouting, believe me, acknowledging the complexity does give us agency. As with trust, it helps us understand that disillusionment is not fate. It's a process that can be slowed down, even reversed. But for that, we need to understand the next part of the story. We focused a lot on the root causes of things, explaining what political trust or disillusionment are. But what happens when no one believes in democracy anymore? What do the real consequences of distrust look like across Europe? That's what we will talk about in the next episode. Before we close, a quick reminder. Democracy Cracks is produced by TEPSA as part of the Horizon Europe project ActEU. I am Eva Ribera, Program Manager at TEPSA, and I'm the one behind this series. If you're curious about the data, studies, or research that inform what you've heard today, you will find all the references in the episode description. And if anything in this episode made you think, smile, question, or disagree, please reach out. I'm always happy to hear from you. See you next time.